What we really need is two very different cultures under the same roof, an innovation culture and an execution culture. It's not either or, it's and they have different rules, different incentive systems, and a different culture.
Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you and your company stay relevant in an era of rapid change and 10x your results in both your professional and personal life. Each week, I'll bring you corporate innovators, entrepreneurs, authors, keynote speakers, and thought leaders such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Brad Feld, Tim Harford, Karen Dillon, Jenny Blake, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, Pascal Finette, Ryan Blair, and Ash Moria, to name just a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some quick, digestible insights to help you end your week on a high as you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school and consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia and Singapore that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methods and tools to navigate change and survive and thrive in an era of rapid disruption. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 257 with Alex Osterwalder. Alex is an entrepreneur, speaker, and business model innovator. He's the co-founder of Strategyzer, a software-as-a-service company that helps organizations develop new growth engines, better value propositions, and powerful business models via online applications and facilitated online courses. In 2015, Alex won the Strategy Award by Thinkers 50, called the Oscars of Management Thinking by the Financial Times, and ranks number 15 among the leading business thinkers of the world. In 2013, he won the inaugural Innovation Luminary Award by the European Union. Alex is lead author of Business Model Generation and Value Proposition Design, which sold over 1 million copies in 37 languages. USA Today named Business Model Generation among the 12 best business books of all time. The German edition was named Management Book of the Year in 2011, and Fast Company magazine named it one of the best books for business owners in 2010. Alex invented the Business Model Canvas, a strategic management tool to visualize, challenge, and reinvent business models. Leading organizations and startups around the world use it. Previous startups Alex was involved with include Net Finance and Arvetica. Alex holds a PhD from HEC in Switzerland, and he is a founding member of the Constellation, a global not-for-profit organization aiming to make HIV and AIDS, as well as malaria, history. We explored a number of topics in this episode, including 1. How much of your R&D should be invested into disruptive innovation? 2. Why what got you here won't get you there, and how disruptive innovation requires different methods and behaviors? And 3. The value of taking a portfolio approach to corporate innovation investments. You'll learn this and a hell of a lot more in this conversation with the one and only Alex Osterwalder. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Pleasure to be here.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And as I mentioned before we kicked off, I've been following some of your stuff online for a few years, so it's good to finally connect. You're joining me all the way from sunny Switzerland. Were you following the team as part of the recent World Cup? Or?
Please don't talk about that. That's you were suffering.
Well, you did make it out of that group stage, so I mean, it wasn't all bad. It was better than Australia, at least.
Yeah, but we're still suffering.
Yes, I can imagine. Football is a lot closer to the hearts of Europeans than it is to most Australians, so I totally understand. So our people, well, my listeners will know you from your books, such as Value Proposition Design, for example, as well as tools that you've created, such as the Business Model Canvas and the Value Proposition Canvas. And today, Alex, I wanted to unpack some of the talking points in a recent article of yours called What Leaders Need to Do to Boost Innovation. I think this covers off on a few key points that a lot of corporate executives that I come across seem to sometimes be, say, not really in tune with. So one thing you've talked about in this particular article is that when it comes to investing in R&D, that organizations should invest, say, 10% into disruptive innovation. Why 10%? Why not more? Why not less? Why is that the magic number?
If we would get 10%, I think that would already be very good. I think the most important to take away is I think it's important to find some institutionalized funding of research in business research. That's research that goes beyond technology and pure products and maybe, customer segments. Because at the end of the day, some companies, they even show how you can innovate with inferior technology. The Nintendo Wii disrupted for a while the game console industry with inferior technology, but a better value proposition for an untapped market. So I think we need to do a lot more legwork, a lot more research when it comes to business innovation and not just the traditional R&D.
Yeah, and do you think this is a common issue that you come across in your work, Alex, that a lot of executives, large organizations confuse innovation with just technology?
Well, I think there are a couple of myths, and the fact that, one of the big myths is that innovation equals R&D, innovation equals technology. That is a myth that a lot of people, still have. We need to bust that myth. R&D can, but doesn't have to be the foundation, or technology doesn't have to be the foundation of innovation. I think there's a huge opportunity around new and better value propositions. Typically take the banking industry, huge opportunity for new value propositions, not necessarily based on new technology. I think that's a big one. And then there's a huge opportunity around better business models that are not just competing on products and new segments, but really a superior business model. So I think there's a lot to be done there. And I see that across the board, across industries. There are very few companies that understand innovation very well, like Amazon, for example.
Yeah, and on the whole notion of thinking beyond technology and process, I mean, if you look at some of the most transformative innovations of the 20th century, I mean, moving from steam to electricity, it took about 4 decades for us to really reap the economic benefits of doing so, because the entire processes, systems, and cultures around electricity needed to come along for that journey. It wasn't enough to simply plug in an electric motor. And today it seems like a lot of organizations that are embarking on these, say, digital transformation projects are simply taking 20th century processes that may no longer really do the job today and just digitizing them and saying, okay, we're being innovative.
Yeah, I think, always when there's new technology, take the film industry, what's the first thing people did is they filmed theater. So I think we really need to understand what the new value propositions are around new technologies. But again, I think there's a bit of a challenge when we say innovation. Please don't think technology. Banking. When we say innovation in banking, for example, people immediately think fintech. Well, I think we need to think beyond fintech. Of course, there's a lot going on, and technology can drive a lot of innovation. But at the end of the day, it's really about two very basic things. How do we create more value for customers? And how do we do that with a scalable and profitable business model? That's where the opportunities are. And that may or may not be based on technology.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned Amazon a few seconds ago, but what else are you seeing in this space where organizations are, say, more effectively allocating 5 to 10% of R&D into disruptive innovation that goes beyond just technology?
I think the next step, kind of, if I can just take another, a myth that we might have to bust, that we should bust, is that once you have that money, which is increasingly the case, there are some companies that have built business model innovation divisions or departments. So it is happening. But the other myth is that innovation is expensive and you need to make big bets. I think it's quite the contrary. You can't actually pick the winners. You need to invest first, small amounts of money in many teams, and those teams that show progress, meaning they find evidence, they should get follow-up funding. So basically, innovation is actually not expensive. It's pretty cheap. It's in the scale-up phase when you already have a lot of evidence that something can work, that it gets expensive. So what we really need to do is create more of a VC-style funding when it comes to innovation, and almost build a little Silicon Valley within. So that's, I think, one of the big things, one of the big success factors. And a couple of companies that we're working with are starting to do that. They're saying, hey, we're not going to make big risky bets because most of those blow up anyways. we're going to work a lot more like venture capitalists, and we're going to fund a lot of projects in the companies so we can create a couple of winners. Because the research actually shows that to create one unicorn, so-called unicorn or multi-billion dollar, company with a big return, you actually need to invest in at least 25 projects, and that I'm saying investment, not ideas, investments in 25 projects of which 24 will fail. So if you don't do that, you won't get the big growth. You won't get the big return. Making, a few big investments will actually just increase the risk that you're going to fail big. What you really want to do is make many small investments and then do follow-up investments like venture capitalists do.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, Alex, and it aligns with something I've discussed on the show previously around this notion of a business case alternative, where currently, if you have an idea in most organizations, you've got to complete a business case, and if you're successful, you get a big bag of money, and oftentimes that's based on just market research, but it's also based on untested assumptions, and it ends up being a very big, risky bet versus having placed lots of small bets to identify where the opportunities really are. And when it comes to venture capital, like you've said, oftentimes they build funds of funds. So they're investing in not just 25, but maybe 100 startups because they're trying to play the numbers game. And ultimately, they have the needle in the haystack that returns that 100x return that covers the losses of the majority. Yet for some reason in the corporate world, we have this sense that we need to make the right bet each time, and we overplan and do all this work and overinvest, but ultimately it ends up still failing because we're not taking that sort of short experimental approach that VCs do, where they move from, say, seed funding to Series A to Series B to Series C. Oftentimes we go straight to Series D and then cross our fingers hoping for the best.
Well, there's an explanation for that. It's because once you have an established business model, once you are a large company, you're actually really only focused on management and improvement of your existing business portfolio, right? That means when you have an existing business, you actually know the variables, you know the market, you know the value propositions. There is not that much uncertainty, even if uncertainty is increasing now. You know a lot of the variables. So in that kind of case, you expand the workforce, you build a new factory. Failure is not an option, and business plans actually make sense because that's the execution environment. That's the environment of existing business models. Now, the problem is that most senior leaders, they grew up in that space. They made their career in that space. They advanced in that space. So they apply the rules of that culture, of an execution and management culture, which is not wrong. Again, it's the right culture for that space. But they apply it to the innovation space, and that is completely wrong. And what you do with that is, number one, you kill innovation, and number two, you actually maximize the risk of failure. And nobody wants that, but that's exactly what's happening. So a lot of experienced venture capitalists, they say that if you increase the funding, you increase the likelihood of a startup, or in this case, a corporate venture, to fail. Because if you give people money, what are they going to do? They're going to execute the idea. So a big, shiny business plan that looked great on paper, might not work in reality. So if we have the money, obviously we're going to go execute. We're going to go build something. We're going to go build that platform. So we maximize the risk of failure because we apply the rules of execution and management to innovation. What we really need is two very different cultures under the same roof, an innovation culture and an execution culture. It's not either or. It's and they have different rules, different incentive systems, and a different culture.
Yeah, and there's a few good things you've touched on there that I wanted to unpack. I mean, when you talk about startups, I see this all the time. I mean, we've incubated over 100 startups, and in the ecosystem here in Australia and the US that I've worked with, oftentimes getting that early stage funding can be a blessing, but more often than not, it's a curse, particularly if they haven't reached product market fit yet, because oftentimes they interpret it as validation for their business model, and so they end up hiring people they don't need, they end up spending marketing dollars on a product that nobody wants, they end up building out all these features that no customer asked for, and ultimately ends up being their demise, versus not getting that big bag of money up front, being more diligent with each dollar, and therefore running a lot more experiments to really figure out what the market wants. And then you end up building a culture that's based on experimentation rather than one that's based on placing that big bet up front. But you also mentioned that your typical traditional organization has been built upon these principles of certainty, and that's how the world looked in the 20th century. Things moved slower than they do today. And if you're operating in conditions of extreme certainty, then voracious planning makes a lot of sense. But if things are uncertain, then obviously you're working with a lot of untested assumptions and you need to be a bit more experimental in your approach. So when we talk about two cultures, Alex, as you've mentioned, earlier in the conversation we said invest up to 10% of R&D into disruptive innovation. Does this suggest that perhaps up to 10% of your people should be thinking a little bit more like an entrepreneur?
Doesn't necessarily mean 10% of the people. I think what you really want to make sure is that you have institutionalized funding to create a constant pipeline of new ideas. Because of those 100 projects, only few will become real growth engines that will, really make it to your business portfolio. What you want to do is have small teams that start out, and when they find evidence, they get follow-up investments and the team grows. What you really, I think, this is something I haven't seen yet very much, is you want to cultivate, a team of professional entrepreneurs. All they do is search for value propositions and business models. Some of those will become successful and create new growth engines, and the other ones will just search, trial and error, and find again. It's a little bit like, the pharmaceutical companies finding molecules. You have scientists who never ever in their career find a molecule, but they're not seen as failures because they contribute to the system, right? You need failure, you need variety, you need all of that diversity to actually get one molecule out of the big mass. It's the same thing with growth innovation. What you do want to make sure is that those innovation teams, those professional innovation teams, that they have access to the people of the execution engine, because sometimes you need to talk to people from the supply chain. You want to bring them in for a week. Sometimes you want to talk to the sales force. You want to bring marketing people in, in the early stages to experiment. So not everybody should be part of the innovation engine. Some should go back and forth. But you do want to have a couple of professional innovators that are really, really good at searching for value propositions and business models in conditions of extreme uncertainty, right? That is what you want to cultivate. And that's definitely not going to be 10% of your entire staff. In particular, at the early stages, you need only very few people, okay? Then once such a project matures and it becomes bigger and it starts to scale, it actually becomes part of the execution engine. So the teams that start out on the innovation side, they might actually shift to the execution side. And then you want to see which part of that team is going to jump over to execution. Because again, the skills of scaling, the skills of management and execution are different than the skills of innovation and entrepreneurship. So you want to make sure you allocate your talent in the right way. And I think every company actually does have that innovation and entrepreneurship talent. There's just no space for those people to thrive today. So we need to create that space.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And the whole notion of, you hear it all the time when companies say that innovation is everyone's job. And I mean, it depends on how you interpret that saying. Of course, everybody sees things, everybody sees opportunities for improvement, or at least they should be observing opportunities for improvement or identify problems. Why are things done a certain way? Why aren't they done a different way? Asking questions all the time. But when it comes to actually running those experiments, people have their day jobs and it's very difficult for everyone in the organization to do this. So by having a central team where those experiments or ideas are funneled into to run those early stage tests, and then if there is some traction, perhaps the people who observe those opportunities, if they feel passionately enough about that, perhaps they're given an opportunity to engage. And on the notion of different types of people. Obviously, in the early stage, you need people who embrace risk, embrace uncertainty, want to run experiments. They're all about ambiguity. But then as you find product market fit and scale it, then you just need managers. And
let me just build on that for a second, because I think you touched on something that is very, very important. When senior leaders say everybody needs to be an innovator, I think that's a very dangerous way of framing things. So it's actually partially true and partially completely wrong and very, very risky. So everybody needs to innovate within their space. If you're running a supply chain, you want to make incremental improvements. If you're running, finance or accounting, you want to make incremental innovations, but you don't want to do creative accounting, otherwise you go to jail, right? So of course, everybody should think in an innovative way to innovate within their space. But there's a huge difference between somebody whose job it is to create new growth engines and somebody who's managing a factory, a plant, or a sales force. It's a different type of innovation. And you basically can draw on some of Clayton Christensen's work. There are three types of innovation. There is incremental improvement innovation, efficiency innovation. That's one, and you'll find that in the execution engine. Then there is growth innovation, which is at the completely other end of the spectrum, where you have people creating completely new growth engines. Those are different jobs. Those require different skills. So everybody needs to be an innovator, yes, but also no, because it's different types of innovation with different types of skills. And then in the middle, you have sustaining innovation, which is mainly about replacing old products with new ones, which is kind of in between, because it could be that you're using the same business model and just changing the value propositions, which still means you need to deal with uncertainty, but not as much as if you are really more of a corporate intrapreneur creating a new growth engine. So I think it's very dangerous to say everybody needs to be an innovator. Yes, in a certain way, but very different ways at the same time. So if you don't understand that, you're not going to create the right innovation processes. There are different innovation processes for efficiency innovation, sustaining innovation, and growth or more substantial or breakthrough innovation. They're very, very different types of processes that require very different skills and even incentive systems and culture. So I don't think senior leaders all really understand innovation well enough to make those organizational design decisions. And that's not because they're not smart enough. Obviously, when you run 100,000 person organization or more, you are smart, but trained to execute and manage. I think we need to see the rise of a new kind of leader, or at the very least, part of the executive team that really, really deeply understands innovation. And again, I'm not talking R&D, I'm talking about innovation.
Yeah. I mean, what you've said there aligns with the whole three horizons model by McKinsey, whereby the processes, values, systems that you use to work on Horizon 3 innovation is going to be fundamentally different to that for Horizon 1. And today, so many organizations, I think, still fall in the trap of applying Horizon 1 thinking and systems to Horizon 3 ideas, and also Horizon 1 thinking people to Horizon 3 ideas. So when it comes to finding people who think more about that growth innovation, that disruptive innovation, how might organizations go about either identifying those people internally? I mean, you've said you've got that entrepreneurial talent, but how do they do that without risking attracting the wrong types of people who may actually inadvertently sabotage these Horizon 3 or disruptive innovation efforts because the lens through which they see the world is very, say, traditional versus entrepreneurial?
Well, I think it's really what Ray Dalio would call idea meritocracy. You just need to create the space for those innovations to thrive. Now, if you get people who are not good at innovation and entrepreneurship, and they start with very small funding, you're not losing a lot of money. You're only going to give the teams, follow-up funding that bring evidence to the table. So I don't think there's a big risk of even, working with the wrong people, because just like startups, that are not well run or that pursue stupid ideas, they die because they won't find customers, and they definitely won't find venture capital money, though these days, a lot of silly ideas are funded as well. But if you really kind of follow this approach of small bets and then investing, making follow-up investments in bets that, show some progress, that show some evidence, you don't have a large risk. You don't actually need to really search for those people, because they will automatically be drawn to that space. What you need to put in place is the system that allows those that are really good at innovation and entrepreneurship to thrive. And those are not, they won't waste a lot of money because the system actually weeds them out. That's the beauty of the whole thing. So, some people might say, but what if we took that all away? Then we wouldn't have that waste. Well, it's simply impossible. Why do venture capitalists have portfolios? Because it's impossible to pick the winner up front. And I think we need to understand that in corporations. You can't pick the winner without investing in the losers. And if we want to replace the ugly word losers with a better one, because they're not losers, they're contributing to the system, we could call them nearlings. They nearly made it, right? And a bit nicer. But we need to build that space in that system, and things will happen. I would almost say automatically. Of course, you need to put in place the organizational design, and you do need to have people who can manage that. But we have the answers now. That's the crazy thing. We have the answers, and we even have role models like Amazon. It's not a surprise that it's one of the most successful companies in the world, the one that grew fastest from zero to $100 billion. And, Amazon Web Services, amazing growth. It's not an accident. It's not just luck. It's really system. We just need to copy those things. Jeff Bezos describes that pretty clearly in his letters to shareholders. So we just need to copy. Obviously, sounds easier than doing it, and we have a lot of answers. There's a whole community of thinkers who are doing this in different companies. Now it's the time to scale the answers that we have, and we need companies that are courageous. And I'm seeing some that are going down that path, but just not enough. So we're going to see a huge corporate graveyard of future Kodaks and Nokias.
Yeah, well, the stat that everyone refers to at a lot of innovation conferences is that up to 50% of the S&P 500 will be replaced in the next 10 years, courtesy of some research by Insight. But you're exactly right in terms of it exists. The methodology, the systems, the process, whether it's applying that VC metered funding approach, whether you want to call it the lean startup for large organizations, whatever you call it, it's all semantics. But that approach of applying small amounts of funding based on experiments, validate some of those initial assumptions, get a little bit more funding, validate some subsequent assumptions, get a bit more funding. That process exists. I mean, it's been documented by various thought leaders. Obviously, you've documented stuff in that space. Guys like Ash Maurya have, guys like Eric Ries have. Yet, for some reason, what I see in this space is that oftentimes organizations try to reinvent the wheel and ask questions that perhaps have already been answered by numerous books. And whether that's a reflection of not having done the work, not having read the books, or whether that's a reflection of paralysis by analysis. I mean, what's your view on that? Because I feel like sometimes, because these organizations are being led by leaders who came out of that traditional sort of organization, place bets slowly, make sure you've planned and got all your ducks in a row, that when it comes to changing, it's not necessarily that the methods aren't there. It's just that we'd rather just dip our feet into the water versus dive in.
Yeah, I would actually not blame the leaders and the companies.
Mm-hmm.
I blame the people who have the answers or who write the books. I think if you just take business books, they're simply not practical and applicable enough, and the messages are too complicated. And everybody talks about storytelling. If all the business books had, maybe 10 times less stories and would just focus on the substance and make it practical and easy, probably business leaders would listen a little bit more. So I would blame, the thinkers, myself included, that we're not doing work well enough to help organizations transform. And that includes the consultancies, McKinsey's and Bain's and so. We're not doing our job well enough, because if we did, we could convince, leaders of large organizations to do their job well when it comes to innovation. Now, obviously, it's a very complicated problem. So while we have a lot of answers, there are a couple of things like the short-term thinking and, incentives of CEOs maybe not to think long-term growth. And, activist investors don't help because they're interested in the short-term growth. They don't care about long-term strategies over the next 20, 50 years. So there's a couple of blockers there. But I would really blame the community of thinkers and the consultants out there of not doing their job well enough to provide practical, simple, and applicable answers. So that's why we're working on a new book, to provide some of those answers in an applicable way. And we hope that we can do a better job and start to get, senior leaders around the world to listen. We've done it with the business model canvas and have millions of practitioners around the world applied the business model canvas to do things, the doers, if you want.
Mm-hmm.
What we now need to figure out is how do we address the senior leaders who are not so much interested in the business models, but in the portfolio of businesses that they're managing. So we created the business portfolio map, our latest tool together with Yves, to talk to senior leaders in the same way we created the business model canvas. And I do hope we can have a similar impact, but at the senior level in the largest companies around the world. I would really blame the thinkers that we're not doing our job well enough, because otherwise companies would listen more.
Mm-hmm. No, that's an interesting take on. And tell me about the new book. When can we expect it, and what is the nature of the book?
It's coming out in 2019. We actually just started, and the whole idea is around business model portfolios, business portfolios. Companies should manage basically, and what they partially already do, a portfolio of existing businesses. And in that case, start killing the businesses that are not growing anymore and look at the businesses that are prone to disruption. And in particular, then create an innovation pipeline, a portfolio of new businesses that can replace those that are dying, that inevitably will die. Now, that is kind of the core of the book. On the other hand, we realized that we haven't done a good enough job yet to help companies think how they compete on business models rather than just competing on technology, product, and services and price. So we're looking at codifying business, the biggest strategic moves in business history, and providing a couple of business model mechanics to help companies compete on business models when they build those portfolios. And all that with a lot of very practical things, like how do you measure the reduction of risk in innovation, how do you build the right innovation culture, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, the blueprint of how you want to build the next Amazon.
Excellent, excellent. I like the sound of it. And in terms of organizations picking this book up and applying some of the teaching, you mentioned some of the barriers that exist around things like incentive structures being short-term, activist investors. I mean, we saw what happened to Jeffrey Immelt over at GE last year, despite having invested a lot in things like the lean startup and placing lots of small bets. And the other thing that organizations often struggle with, or people within organizations who are trying to drive this change struggle with, is getting that buy-in from decision makers, from budget controllers to change the way they do things, to carve out some budget for things like short, rapid experimentation. So does the book explore that, or what are your views in the space of, say, for example, getting stakeholder buy-in?
Well, definitely. I think we don't have the answers, but what do you do against activist investors other than you really have to manage that portfolio well? I mean, you mentioned the example of Jeff Immelt. One of the things that became maybe the main reason why he had to leave or was retired or retired early is that, you can't invest in innovation and neglect the core business. You have to perform on both fronts. Innovation is the future. So you want to build that. You want to, build the Amazon Web Services or the Nespressos if you already have a series of businesses and you need to create new growth engines. But you can't neglect the management of the existing portfolio. And that, sounds trivial, but it's not a trivial thing. So managing those portfolios, the execution portfolio and the exploration portfolio, that is ultimately what will help you win. The execution portfolio is what helps short-term, the short-term thinking. And with the exploration portfolio, you build the long-term thinking. And what's interesting is it doesn't have to be that expensive. So we always think innovation is expensive, but at the early stages, it's not expensive. Now, it does mean that you still have to have a very good story to shareholders and activist investors of how those innovations are going to pay out. Just like when you're an entrepreneur, you have to have a good story that you tell your investors as well. So we'll answer a lot of the things, I'd say, more around organizational design and the practical aspects in building that innovation engine and execution engine. Some of the tactical aspects we won't be able to address, otherwise we'd have to spend 5 years writing the book and 1,000 pages.
And then nobody would read it.
What we really want to do is keep it practical and straightforward.
Yep.
For those aspects where we're specialists. I think there are other people who can talk about activist investors better than we can.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And You touched on a point there around not neglecting the core business. And that's why it comes back to investing, say, 10% of your R&D into disruptive innovation, because it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You still have, especially if you're a company that has a repeatable, scalable business model, you are a listed company with shareholders, you've got obligations to them to continue paying those dividends, to continue growing, but at the same time, you need to have one eye on the future. It's like steering the Titanic in a different direction rather than, well, yeah, it's about steering the Titanic in a different direction, but you still got to keep that Titanic afloat while you're doing that. So that makes perfect sense. But one thing I wanted to touch on, we're running out of time, but just on the notion of something I see in organizations today is that they will set up oftentimes what amount to token innovation lead roles, heads of innovation roles, whatever you want to call it. And oftentimes they pluck somebody from out of the wilderness who doesn't have much experience in business. They're quite young and they think, well, they're young, so they must get innovation and entrepreneurship, and give them a small token budget and let them do what they can do. I mean, what's your thought on that type of approach?
I guess that was a rhetorical question. So I think that's a huge issue, right? The number of times I see leaders saying, hey, we're going to take somebody young with fresh thinking straight out of business school or so, or, they did their startup. You'll have a huge problem with that in large corporations because nobody will take them seriously. So I would recommend the contrary. You need to take somebody who's senior and very often maybe even from the own organization, and they've really build things in the organization, maybe new growth engines, maybe the brand, but they are respected. And at the same time, you want to give them a huge amount of power. Because I think what's really missing in innovation, often actually the money is there. To a certain extent, the space is being created, but what's really missing is power. We need to give innovation and innovation leaders a lot more power. That's why we wrote a Harvard Business Review blog post, a bit provocative with Eve, where we said every company needs a chief entrepreneur who has just as much power as the CEO, or like in some companies, even more power than the CEO, where the CEO becomes more of a chief operating officer, and the chief entrepreneur really, kind of leads the company forward in the future. But you want to have, execution and exploration, entrepreneurship, innovation on the same in your org chart, because otherwise innovation is going to be killed. And we're always going to fight innovation. Innovation won't have access to the core resources of the core business. And then, the corporate innovators will just be entrepreneurs in chains because they won't have the advantages of large companies. What do large companies have that startups don't have? Well, they have customers. Well, then let's give access to customers, which is not so easy because key account managers will fight, tooth and nail to keep innovators away so they can make their bonus. Access to brand, access to patents, access to, the supply chain. All those things will only happen when innovation has power. So I really do believe we need to have chief entrepreneurs, and in companies like Amazon and before at Apple, we do have chief entrepreneurs that are at the head of the company. In most other companies, we have chief execution officers. So guess what we'll get? In many cases, great execution and management. Some cases not. But what we really want is also chief entrepreneurs at the very top of companies, so we actually get entrepreneurship, innovation, and growth. Otherwise, we won't see it happen.
Yeah, and power is such a great point because speed is absolutely fundamental to success, whether it's an early stage startup or whether it's a corporate innovation project of some kind. And, John Boyd, the famous military strategist, coined the term OODA, observe, orient, decide, act. The faster you can observe, orient, decide, and act, the faster you'll be able to disorient your opponent, or the faster you'll be able to find, say, product market fit. Now, if your head of innovation, quote unquote, hasn't been given the power to make decisions, and every time they need to make a decision, they need to call, let's say, a steering committee meeting, they're not going to move any fast enough to really make that dent on disruptive innovation.
Yeah, I'd say, I'm working with a couple of very large companies also on their overall corporate design. And they're asking me often, okay, so where do we put that innovation engine? Is that a completely separate thing, or is it in the business units, which are multi-billion-dollar businesses, right? So the answer is actually it's both. you do want to have innovation engines within the business units, but what you will expect there is, more sustaining innovation and inside the established business model. So you also need to have an innovation engine that is completely separate and that has the freedom to explore new business models, obviously that have some kind of synergy in one way or another with the core business. So when Amazon Web Services started out, well, there was a core synergy with e-commerce, business to consumer, because they were using the same infrastructure, right? So innovation needs to be within the existing organizational structure and needs to be a separate new entity that can explore more substantial growth. And another myth is that any type of growth innovation, will cannibalize the older business models. That's simply not true. It can be the case, but again, think Amazon Web Services. That was a completely separate growth engine that had huge synergies with the core. When you take Nespresso, daughter company of Nestle 40 years ago when they started out, they were targeting the espresso segment. It didn't cannibalize the coffee business of Nestle under Nescafé, but it expanded it because that was mass market. And with Nespresso, they were targeting the luxury or high-end market. So innovation, substantial growth innovation, disruptive innovation doesn't have to cannibalize the core business. So you want to have innovation engines within the business units, but also outside, because otherwise you're never going to get substantial growth innovation in real future business models.
Yep. Very well said, Alex. Well, you've left our audience with a lot of lessons to unpack in this conversation, but we have 3 minutes left, which is just enough time for our lightning round. Are you ready to rock and roll?
Sure.
Let's do this. Question number 1, Alex, is if you could work for any organization at any stage of the company lifecycle, who would it be and why?
It'd be Strategyzer, the company that we're building. That's why I'm building it.
Well, that tends to be what a lot of entrepreneurs say. So well said. Question number 2, maybe not as easy. If you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
Right now, I'd be curious. The CEO of Nestle is not somebody who I interact with very, very often. Just asking him, do you really think you're setting up Nestle for future growth?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, what are your thoughts about it?
I don't think so.
Great. And lucky last, Alex, you've been obviously quite active in the space for a number of years, pumping out Harvard Business Review articles, pumping out books, working with organizations across the world, speaking at keynotes. Do you have any rituals or routines to stay on top of your game?
Never stop experimenting, never stop exploring, never stop being curious.
Yep, love it. And that aligns with something that Steve Blank said way back when. I had him on episode, I think, 7, and he was saying, just stay curious. So that was a good 2.5 years ago. But it's interesting seeing the commonalities between how people answer that question, particularly entrepreneurial thinkers. A lot of the time it comes down to just staying curious and experimenting and just getting out of that comfort zone day after day. So our audience can find out more about you at alexosterwalder.com. They can obviously check out Strategyzer.com and hit you up on Twitter at alexosterwalder. And I'll add all of those information to the show notes for our listeners. They can obviously check out your books as well on Amazon. Any parting words of wisdom for our corporate executives listening, Alex?
It's time to change, otherwise you'll end up on the corporate graveyard.
Fantastic. Love it. Well, thank you so much for appearing on Future Squared. I know it's about 12:15 in the morning over there in Switzerland, so I think you should probably go and get some sleep. Thanks again. Hope you have a great night.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Cheers. Hi guys, Steve again. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to discuss episodes like this one, request guests for new episodes, propose questions, and access exclusive podcast-related content, join the brand new Future Squared Facebook group. Just search for the Future Squared group on Facebook or visit bit.ly/Future Squared group. That's bit.ly/Future Squared group. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, please take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Google Play. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. This episode was powered by Collective Campus. Until next time, Future Squared is out.